Well, here we are again in this hopefully happier version of a long day's journey into night. Certainly it is a story that is far worse than what that drama was saying concerning a particular family, for it's talking about the whole human family and its descent. But there is that way out, which is through the Bible, and as it is described in Jesus Christ, who by God's incredible way and means can take any one of us out of this dreadful story and cause us to enter into God's world of order and love and light and of eternal life. All right, there we were with Freud and his three psychic so-called regions, the so-called ego, the id, and the superego, which the elite back in 1932 were expressing a deep interest in for reasons that they had concluded were noble. His teaching, Freud's teaching, centered on the idea that these regions were evolutionary developments of the race, one of which, the alleged superego, he emphasized as being based in man's so-called animistic past. So he, like today's abortionists, remember, he was an avant-garde figure like they are, felt no compunction whatsoever in doing what he wanted with it, this superego. His conclusion was that it no longer served a legitimate purpose in human affairs. In fact, he taught that it now placed a bar against man's evolutionary development. He was a thorough Darwinian evolutionist. He idolized Darwin. Naturally, they were into the same desecration. Though he claimed that his conclusion had been arrived at through scientific analysis and empirical reasoning, it nevertheless remained based in assumption and circular reasoning in requiring a belief in evolution, etc. In other words, it was subjective, with himself also being the product of what he claimed was an objective investigation and evaluation. He was knee-deep in what he was looking into, and very much one of its controlled figures. What precisely had he concluded that we absolutely need to know? His conclusion was that the necessary fusion of the ego, so-called, and the id was being repressed by the superego. Recall that the only true evil, according to Plato's and Neoplatonism's idea of the good, was that which would try to create a gap in the chain of all of the goods of its inclusivity, that which would seek to repress its whole, its wonderful, expanding, optimistic whole, in which oppositions unto a perfection were to be the product. Plato envisioned his perfect society, which the elect of the present world order envisioned as the one they wanted to create. A sort of the new world order that they are imagining under Plato's work called the Republic. They were to be the super guardians of this new world order, Plato's Republic. Well, this was exactly what Freud was trying to build. A new culture, a sublime culture, by getting rid of this terrible suppressor, the superego, which was stopping the progress of the id and the ego, which, if they could only work together, we just have this great new world order. Now, this repression, this activity he spoke repeatedly and with vehemence against as being both the source of man's so-called neuroses and psychoses, as well as it was, according to him, begetting all of man's aggressive behavior, both against the ego as well as against society as a whole. It was the instigator of wars to him. In fact, this depiction of his was personified in his harsh portrayal, naturally, of the Western religion's God, the Father, who he said troubled man no end with his unconditional and dictatorial, "Thou shalt and thou shalt not." Now, if you're an elite figure and a formulator of the League of Nations, who had failed to get the U.S. to commit itself to the displacement of its sovereignty for the sake of a so-called universal disarmament, which did happen in 1921-22, you would likely find Freud's thinking about the so-called superego very interesting. You'll see why in a minute. Understandably, therefore, Freud's program of correcting the so-called superego's allegedly flawed development was to dike it off. In the book that we will be looking at a little bit more closely in a moment, his new introductory lectures, he so proudly describes what he was intending to do with the superego. It was based on what was done when the Netherlanders managed to dike the North Sea inlet, the Zuiderzee, which presumably was the superego, and filled it with the waters of the river Ischsel, presumably his so-called id's products, its quote-unquote libido. This was to enable the creation of the Ischsel Meer, or Lake Ischsel, as the chosen way, he saw, of liberating the id, through which system it could combine with the ego to form a supposed new sublime culture free from what he saw were harmful inhibitions. One should realize that Freud hated religion, which, upon reading his works, was revealed as being the religion of the Western world, or, in other words, Christianity. It was what he desired most to destroy, and through his system he realized a way of doing so. Now, when I say Christianity, I'm not describing what comes in its name most often. One must remember that Christianity was being consumed not soon after it was born, when the world, flesh, and devil came in and started to create a false product in its name, when the Platonic and Neoplatonic idea of the good became its prime base, its way of communicating its new creation of a Christ figure and body of Christ that they had designed to lead humanity away from the true Christianity, and which religion it was formed, that was being formed by them, was the creation of the first phases of Catholicism as it developed, and then began to destroy true Christians in a Holocaust by which untold millions of actual believers in Jesus Christ were destroyed and tortured in the most exotic ways one could fathom. So it was a program that came to give Christianity and was designed to give Christianity an appeal to certain types and a very bad name to so many who would not look at it twice in terms of a matter of wanting to have a relationship with God. And in the meanwhile, they threw out the baby with the bathwater. So, that Christianity was what was being raised, and the ideal by the powers of darkness was to destroy the true Christianity, because that's what it hates. Order, God, Bible, family, nation. Okay, by way of explanation as to what it was Freud realized upon studying his works, it becomes possible to grasp that his three psychological regions had an ancient predecessor that he was quite familiar with. Its precedence was apparent in terms of its definitive description of the presence and work in man of the same three regions he was purporting to have discovered, for they were described in the Bible, and especially in its New Testament, nearly 2,000 years before Freud came along. One, upon comparing Freud's description of them against that of the Bible, becomes able to discern that what Freud had done was simply to replicate each of the Bible's revelations concerning these three particular entities. However, his duplication consisted of juxtaposing the Bible's description definition of each of them to suit his program. We'll presently be realizing exactly what that was. One sees what he had done upon realizing that what the Bible described as the fallen man, Adam, fits exceedingly well into Freud's description of the so-called ego. Except that according to Freud, the fallen so-called ego had arrived at its broken state for quite another reason than the one the Bible described, which reason, as Freud saw it, required the presence and work of the so-called superego. What Freud's version offered was the opposite, in that the so-called superego had been positioned as the perpetrator of man's essentially fallen state. Though that biblical terminology does not in any way conjure what he meant, still, man's easily observable condition of brokenness was required in order for him to do what he did in altering the reason for it. It's highly important now to note that the Bible, in contradistinction to Freud's depiction of man's problematic state, had man's fall as having come about through the work of sin. This observation, it is again very important to note, ties in to Freud's revelation of a so-called third psychological region, the so-called id, as representing the purported, quote, instincts, unquote, of lust and death, which so-called region and description of, in terms of its activity, also had a predecessor in the Bible. For all of Freud's observations of the so-called id's behaviors find a comparable representative in the Bible when they are compared not only with its fulsome description and definition of sin, but distinctively with Paul's Romans 7 very precise description and definition of the, quote, sin that dwells in our members, end quote. What this means about Paul's description of sin and that of Freud's definition of the so-called id is that they are the same thing that's being described. Yet, what we'll find is that Freud had altered the roles of each to suit what will be his need to alter the role of the so-called superego. Let's see what that means. Let's now consider again the so-called superego as Freud described it. We find that according to his program and logic, it was described as prohibitively repressive of the id, thus forbidding what Freud required us to believe was that the id's necessary union with the so-called ego was being stymied by the superego, which agency he saw as being the prime source of all man's aggressive tendencies. Very well, we've come to where we are now able to realize that all the negativity he had assigned to the so-called superego had now been assigned to what the Bible defines as none other than man's conscience. Upon reading all his works relevant to the subject, one realizes that the so-called superego and the conscience had been one and the same thing, except that now the conscience was playing the role of the supermini, the bad guy that Freud assigned to it, though the Bible makes it essentially a hero in man's struggle against evil, against sin. And upon realizing that the so-called id had been nothing other than the sin that dwells in us, we see that he had merely reversed the roles that the Bible had assigned to all three categories. The conscience served to protect man in the way the Bible describes in the letter to the Romans, chapter 2, verse 15. It bears witness of the law written in man's heart, which attribute serves to beget, quote, thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another, end quote. In other words, should a sinful thought be rising into one's mind through the activity of the sin that dwells in us, the conscience steps in with the witness of the law in the category required, though it may not be a literal appearance of that witness. It is experienced as the law, is experienced as something that's happening that he should be against. And if there's a tendency to think to follow after what sin is producing as a thought, then guilt arises. So this witness of the law required enables human beings to maintain a higher degree of separation from sin than would otherwise be the case. Even so, Freudian psychoanalytical theory was positioning the conscience in the same role that the Bible described about the indwelling presence of sin. Here we see again the conscience, rather than the flesh, was required to be repressed for its evil work, a work precisely defined by Freud when he accused the superego, by which he meant the conscience, of repressing the id, which we now realize had been the sin that dwells in us. Freud's theme was that the flesh required being released, liberated from the stranglehold, and joined in happy union with the so-called ego, or man by any other name. Thus, in reality, Freud's program was releasing the once restrained sin in man, while destroying his capacity to correct that disastrous result, by destroying the role of the conscience. The conscience Freud viewed as needing to be subverted and filled with libido, the id's product in actuality, not based solely on the sexual drive being expressed as many psychoanalysts might wish to view the result, but based as well on sin's death impulse, with both being expressed in us as full a range of activity as we've come to witness today. Very well, we have now noted some of the major causes that have led to where we are as a nation today, with a family and relationship with God that has come to so deep a state of denial that distorter unto extremes of violence can only be on the rise, and without a way of finding its source in order to explain the event, the increase. Nor do we find an effectual means of assuagement against it. Therefore, it's time now to recall what I stated earlier. Allow me now to quote myself. Recall, if you will, where and when I said, "Now there is a specific and identifiable reason, time, and place that developed as the path of disorder's avant-garde, as it were, the Western elite, that as a result of previous effects of a central cause, which is sin in the flesh, became able to produce a graduated means by which the actual usurpation of the conscience at an expanded rate was guaranteed. Does the viewer now recall my having said that after so many times? Well, we have by now witnessed the previous effects of that central cause of all this, the sin that dwells in our members as being the one internal means by which the remaining members of the triunity of evil work in opposition to God and man, which is to say, against all that means God, family, and nation, according to all that is order and its laws. Do we get that by now? I hope so. Allow me to repeat, we have by now witnessed the previous effects of that central cause of all this, the sin that dwells in our members, as being the one internal means by which the remaining members of the triunity of evil work in opposition to God and man, which is to say, against all that means God, family, and nation, according to all that is order and its laws. And now, we are ready to have revealed to us that, quote, specific and identifiable reason, time, and place that developed as a direct result of Freud's work in psychoanalysis, whereby disorders avant-garde, people within certain of the old-time banking families and their institutions, they formed in opposition to order. Institutions like the League of Nations and the UN, etc. Almost ad infinitum now. These were people who became able to produce a guaranteed means of quenching man's conscience and unleashing the sin in his flesh at an increasingly expanded rate. Of course, to these exceedingly useful people on the part of the forces of evil, sin wasn't the problem the Bible said it was. Rather, it seemed to their lean and hungry minds precisely what Freud elucidated, and at a time in which they were feeling terribly impotent in terms of speeding along their need to create a culture more amenable to their needs, to create a kind of nation-state willing to heed all of the commands and demands of an international order governed at the top by what the Bible describes about what will be a 10 kingdom or 10 region or world nation alliance supporting the Antichrist, or man of sin as he's called, or the lawless one. We're talking about the elite and about a society that were working through this new means of creating that would bend a kind of nation state that would heal before them and agree to all of the things that they want. That program of theirs, in having been applied on as broad and social scale as possible, is identifiable as being responsible for today's horrendous fall into sin and violent disorder, and on a scale that can only increase because of what it had inculcated against man's conscience. Prior to its enactment, meetings beginning around the late 20s and early 30s of the 20th century were conducted for the purpose of bringing Freud into a program that would have far-reaching implications for the future of mankind. Again, because of the video medium, I can only disclose a relatively small portion of that trail of activities, or meetings actually, between certain notable members of the League of Nations think tank, the IIIC, or International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation, which became UNESCO upon the creation of the United Nations in carrying out the same program. though much expanded by then. But these in 1932, after several years of discussions with Sigmund Freud, agreed that his psychoanalytical program was precisely what they needed for creating a society more amenable to their, of course, noble requirements, especially that of universal disarmament, which program and even membership in the League the U.S. had roundly rejected. President Harding was largely responsible for that, and quite understandably he suffered a very programmed end. There's not proof of that statement, but it's quite likely in regard to the history of these kinds of things. In regard to their requirements, they had paid close attention to Freud's stated goals for psychoanalysis, especially the one which he had plainly described in his lecture and book, New Introductory Lectures in Psychoanalysis, wherein he stated, "There is one topic which I cannot pass over so easily. I must mention it because it is so exceedingly important, so rich in hopes for the future, perhaps the most important of all the activities of psychoanalysis. What I am thinking of is the application of psychoanalysis to education, to the upbringing of the next generation." End quote. That goal, as well as the content of his research and conclusions in regard to the so-called superego, the conscience, had been precisely what these League members were so interested in talking to him about. Finally, after very few years of meetings between these parties, it was League IIIC member Albert Einstein who, in several discussions conducted by letters and in person with Freud, arrived at an agreement that his psychoanalytical program, especially as it related to the education, or should we say, as Freud put it, the inoculation against the formulation in children of the dreaded superego, would serve the League well. This became a certainty when Henri Bonnet, the Institute's director, was approached with the suggested course for education outlined in the Freud-Einstein discussions, who upon receipt of the plan stated enthusiastically, "You have made an excellent proposal," quote unquote. I remind the viewer that all this is in my book, What Killed America, which is available at Amazon. Thereafter, ways and means were found to place Freud's program into the by now very useful ally, the Progressive Education Network. Remember the one that was started by Colette, Moore, and Erasmus so long before as the humanist education program that was to supplant the more repressed Neoplatonist theme of the idea of the good? Well, by now it was not repressed at all via the Progressive Education Network. In consequence of this development, and as a result of Freud's system having been integrated into the by then vast public education system, man's conscience thus came under an interminable and insuperable form of attack. Through education, as it were, through the alleged opening of people's eyes. Oh, how that mimics the first time that was indicated by the snake in the garden when he was appealing to Eve, telling her her eyes would be opened by eating the fruit. This describes the conversion process having come to be in full swing. Can you, in regard to our conscience, actually realize what that means? It requires no sheepskin to determine that the conscience, through decades of the insertion of this program into children's minds, the children having become parents, and the parents teachers, and the whole thing ramifying to such a grave extent so that the whole education network is its program. The education network having become the media, television, everything, even football, entertainment, the whole thing is wrapped up in it, having thus become a progressively stripped. The conscience's capacity to inform man having become stripped, pertaining to fundamental points of order and disorder, good and evil, it became seared, sealed off from its previous capacity to disable a source, the sin that dwells in our members, now engineering the fate of mankind through opening wide its view and embrace of evolutionary premises in the nearly complete creation of a now existing post-Christian global order. This concludes our three-part segment that I have desired to call Desecration of this video series, Light Stop. In the segment that will follow, we will be looking into an event that occurred over 200 years ago that will be difficult for patriots to take, but they must, as it had been a product following after or near on the heels of the previous great events, the causes of the sin that dwells in our members, when humanism and the new sciences were created. Well, at about the same time, men who were indulging in this interest in science, this new interest in science, and in worldly matters, while claiming Jesus Christ, formed a new nation and an educational apparatus that was to lead into what we have today. Join me next in the video that I will call The Pantheon. Thank you so much for now.